Hi there. My name is Nate Scott, and I'm the Director of Publisher and Songwriter Relations with CCLI. We partner with Christian Copyright Solutions, work very closely with them. So today I'm excited to come and share a perspective from both Christian Copyright Solutions and Christian Copyright Licensing International. Been working in international or intellectual property for over 7 years. Today, we're going to cover some very exciting topics, though they may not be normally exciting, being copyright and other elements. They are very relevant today to the church, and there's lots of questions regarding copyright that come our way. And so hopefully I can clear up some of the misconceptions that you might have and point you in the direction of some resources that are available. So we're going to touch on what is copyright, get back to the basics just for a little bit. And then we'll focus in on the religious service exemption, the topic that comes up regularly with churches, and we can unpack what the key elements are in the religious service exemption and what it doesn't cover for church services. And then we'll focus in on common activities in churches today and which licenses cover those activities. Obviously, these would be activities outside of a religious service exemption. So first off, let's just talk about copyright. What is copyright? It's an exclusive intellectual property right given to the creators of original music, literary, and dramatical works. Broadly, copyright protects by law any asset or legal interest. In terms of this discussion today, we're really focusing in on the musical elements, but it is copyrighted, and a music or musical element or a song itself is it receives copyright protection or is considered copyrighted when it is fixed to a tangible medium. So if you were to write down the lyrics for your song on a piece of paper, you were to record it with the audio recorder on your phone. Let's say you were to create the score on a piece of paper. All of those would be instances where once it was fixed to that form or that means, it is your copyright. You have ownership as the creator of that musical work in our discussion today. And because of that, there is some protection. It's completely separate from the actual registration of a copyright with the Copyright Office. We're not going to go into that level of detail today, but just to be clear, when you, let's say you write a letter, really, if that letter could be considered a literary work, and when you've placed it in a physical form, it's your copyright, it's your property. So copyright covers reproduction. That's one of the key exclusive rights that you have as a creator. Reproduction would be photocopying, making digital copies, even recording or making new recordings of that song. So let's say you created a song, you wrote a song, you created sheet music, you wrote out the lyrics. Making a recording of that song is a reproduction. And as the creator of that work, the author, you have the exclusive right to create that recording. Now, you can grant that right to others, and of course, that's very common today, but you control that right. You own it since you own the work. Along with reproduction, we have display rights. If we're talking about lyrics to a song, it would be displaying that song, making those lyrics available so that folks can view them, whether on a website or through projection. Display rights may be a bit more applicable to works of art, like a painting, photography, statues, but still they relate to church music because we display lyrics for our songs in many settings and project them. In the old days through transparencies, today probably through a computer that has a projector and a projection software, and that would aid in congregational singing. We also have a performance right. If you've written a song, you have the exclusive right to perform that song, play it, or if it were a poem, to recite it, to perform that publicly. Others can't just do that without your approval. That would be the essence of performance. It would cover both the song or a sound recording that you created. Playing that sound recording, the person who wants to play that sound recording has to get the proper rights. Maybe it's through purchasing and then playing it privately, that's fine. But actually to play it publicly, we're going to get into that scenario. That would be public performance, and there's licensing involved. Also, distribution is a right that's covered through copyright protection. That would be selling, leasing, or giving away these tangible products. So if you have the exclusive right to sell that written work or sheet music, to sell your sound recording, to lease it to someone, or to give it away. Others can't give it away without you granting that right to them. Why does copyright exist? Well, in simple terms, it exists to promote the progress of useful arts. Without protection of a work, there just isn't much of an incentive to create. And we're beneficiaries of this copyright protection today. So many songs and books and paintings, you name it, were created and protected. And those who create these works are able to sometimes dedicate their life, their time, to creating these beautiful things that they've been gifted the ability to create. They can devote time to it because there is an incentive, there's a reward for creating, and people can't just take and use what they're creating without the appropriate permissions and many times without compensation. So copyright helps to ensure that there is that cycle, that protection, so there's an incentive for creators to continue to create great songs, great artwork, you name it. That's the basics of copyright. How does copyright affect the church? Today, churches, schools, and organizations are increasingly using technology to create, distribute, and display songs, service sheets, and other copyrighted material that they're probably going to need licensing for. Churches are not completely exempt from copyright laws. Just because they're a nonprofit doesn't mean they're exempt. On the next slide, we're going to go into the religious services exemption. But broadly speaking, there are many, many activities that we do in our churches on a regular basis that do not fall under the religious service exemption. So that's the key today, is understanding what copyright is, which copyright laws churches are exempt from because of the religious service exemption, and then activities that aren't covered by the religious service exemption, what licenses are available so that churches can have the appropriate coverage. One other element to talk about here on why it affects the church, really there is a moral element that we need to respect, and that is that copyrighted material is the property of someone. It's the property of someone who created it. And if we reproduce or if we distribute, all these sort of activities that I went through before without the appropriate permissions, we're taking or we're essentially stealing from that owner. So we have an obligation to ensure that we're doing what's right. And I think this is a way that you can understand which licensing opportunities and are available to you as a church to ensure that you're respecting copyright. Okay, the religious service exemption. Many churches come to us at CCS or CCLI and state that the religious service exemption means that I don't have to have coverage for this. Well, on screen here, you can see what the religious service exemption is. It's in section 110-3 of the US copyright law. And this is the exemption in its entirety. It's actually slightly shorter because at the beginning it says the following shall not be an infringement of copyright. But here it is. Performance of a non-dramatic literary or musical work or of a dramatico-musical work of religious nature or a display of a work in the course of services at a place of worship or other religious assembly shall not constitute an infringement of copyright. The first point here, it's saying the performance of a musical work is permitted within church services. And that's something that we don't need to debate. It's clear here. It says performance at the beginning, and then it says musical work, and then it gives the context in the course of services at either a place of worship or an other religious assembly. So your band at church or vocalist, whatever the case is, they can perform a song in church and it's not an infringement. It's not infringing on that rights owner's exclusive right to perform their work because there's an exemption in the copyright law for religious services. This also applies to playing a sound recording. You can do that in a religious service. You're covered. It's okay. Second, you'll see the portion there where it talks about displaying a work in the course of services. Displaying a work is most likely going to mean displaying the lyrics. One of the challenges with this right, though, is the religious service exemption was probably not written with song lyrics in mind, though it most definitely applies. It's going to be a little bit more, a little bit easier, let's say, to display a painting or a statue or something other than a small sheet that might have lyrics on it that either you have the original or you purchased it, but you can display in that form the lyrics, provided you've legally obtained them. The problem is if we're going to project lyrics in a church service, we're probably going to have to do a reproduction so that we can display them. So though the projection itself, displaying the lyrics, is covered through the religious service exemption, normally there is a reproduction activity that is required beforehand so that it can be projected. And we'll dive into some of those details during some of the next slides. Here are a few myths about the religious service exemption. One that we hear of is all music that's played at church functions is exempt. You'll notice in the text for the religious service exemption, it says in the course of services. It doesn't say all music played at a church or at church functions or religious functions. It's specific to say in services. There are many activities that are held at churches or church functions that are not services. And in any of those cases, we'll get into the details on those, there could be a band performing a song or a vocalist performing a song, or you could be playing an audio file, a master recording, through a variety of mechanisms. That's not covered if it's outside of a service. Another myth that comes up is performing or playing secular music requires separate licensing. The religious service exemption only applies to sacred or Christian music. It's not the case. Remember, it said performance of music, or I think it was musical works. It didn't say whether it was sacred or secular. So there is not a requirement for a license if it's a specific type of music. It's all. Streaming music from services is exempt through the religious services exemption. Unfortunately, for many churches, this is not defined in the religious service exemption. You saw it's very clear. There was no word of streaming. There was nothing about distribution. It's focusing on the service itself. You can play these songs, perform these songs. You can play a sound recording within that service. But once you take that and you retransmit it, which is what streaming is, it's outside of the religious service exemption. Broadcasting services on TV or radio is exempt. It's the same thing as I just spoke about with streaming. It's a retransmission of that service, and TV and radio stations, they have performance licensing that allows them to retransmit. Posting services to YouTube and Facebook is exempt. That's one that comes up a lot. Once again, it's a retransmission. So sorry to sound like a broken record in this case, but these are all examples of myths that come our way. Churches are telling us that the religious services exemption allows me to do this, this, and this. I encourage you, if you feel that way, just to go back and look at the specific verbiage. If you feel that what you're doing or your activities are indeed covered, great, that's for you to decide. Quite frankly, a Christian Copyright Solutions or CCLI is unable to give you permissions to do activities in your church that are outside of the rights that are specifically granted to us. So that's going to be your call. But from our point of view, it's very clear that the religious service exemption does not cover these activities that I just shared. Before we get into specific activities and tie them into licenses, a quick note about blanket licensing versus individual licenses. It is very possible for you to go out and source licensing for individual songs for a variety of purposes. One of the challenges in doing that and securing individual licenses is that you have to go to the owner of each song, and many songs have multiple owners, so it can be a bit of back and forth. Blanket licenses allow churches to use a catalog of copyrighted works for one fee. Blanket licenses apply to specific types of uses, and once again, we're going to get into that, but it allows you to cover and use many, many songs. You just have to ensure that those songs or sound recordings are covered under that license versus going to multiple owners of works and having, it's going to take a bit of time more than anything. And it's just a lot simpler to purchase a blanket license that covers a variety of songs and complete catalogs. So let's talk about reproduction. We hit on that at the beginning of this presentation as one of the exclusive rights of a copyright owner. Some examples of activities that would fall under reproduction insert services would be making copies, digital or physical, of lyrics, mostly for the purpose of display, but a church might print out lyrics or print songs for use in bulletins, programs, liturgies, song sheets. Both of these are examples of reproductions, saving lyrics to your to a hard drive of a computer so that they can be accessed by a projection software. That is a reproduction. Recording worship services. This isn't quite as common today as it was in the past, but churches are still doing this. They'll record whether just audio or audio and video, and then make CDs or DVDs available to a portion of the church for the few that might not have been able to attend that given service. That's a reproduction. Creating custom arrangements where a published version for which you're trying to use does not exist. Let's say there's this great song that you like and there isn't an arrangement for a French horn. Churches are creating custom arrangements for those sort of scenarios. Also creating translations where the specific language that they would like to sing that song in is not available publicly. All of these are examples of reproductions that are available under the church copyright license. So with the custom arrangements and the translating into other languages, once again, I hit on it. It's only possible in cases where a published version does not exist that meets what you're trying to do. With recording worship services, there's a requirement that can only be, I think it's less than 15% of the church size, but still, if your church is doing these sort of activities on a regular basis, or heck, at all, this is the type of activity that falls under a church copyright license with CCLI. We're going to move on to performance. And a performance is considered public if it's in a place open to the public or at any place where a substantial number of persons outside of a normal circle of a family and its social acquaintances is gathered. That really covers many of the activities that we would do at our church. And of course, there's other scenarios outside of the church, but today's discussion is about the church. So we're going to talk about how public performance relates to the church. There's three main organizations that license performance rights, public performance rights in the United States. That's ASCAP, BMI, and CSAC. They control and manage music performance licenses, and every songwriter or publisher who wants to be paid performance royalties registers with one of these three PROs, or performing rights organizations. They together represent millions of songs, and they collect performance license fees for a wide range of uses, from internet radio, TV broadcasts, stadiums, coffee shops, bowling alleys, and restaurants. One thing to add is outside of church services, churches are considered just the same as a coffee shop or a bowling alley or a restaurant in terms of their need for public performance licensing. That's where CCS's Perform Music Facilities license comes into play. This license is going to cover you for performances that happen at your cafes and bookstores at your church, or if you hold special concerts, if you're playing on-hold music, retreats, picnics and barbecues, graduations and awards ceremonies, dance and exercise classes, sporting events, fundraisers, conferences and seminars, vacation Bible school and camps, and even movie nights. With movie nights, in order to show a movie, you need a church video license, but many churches will play music before or after the main event where they show the motion picture. That sort of activity would require a Perform Music license. The Perform Music license has over 28 million Christian and secular songs that you can play or perform anywhere in your facilities or satellite campuses. So if you're seeing places or activities, events in this list where you know that you're playing either commercial recordings or you have bands that are playing copyrighted songs that they did not create, that's a public performance. And it's worth considering a Perform Music license so that you're fully covered for all of these types of activities. Finally, we're going to move on to streaming, and I'm sure for many of you here today, this is the topic that you have questions on, and you've been scratching your head trying to figure out what options are available, what's covered, what's not covered. Hopefully, this next portion will help address those questions that you might have. Churches are live streaming. That shouldn't come as a surprise. When we say live streaming, it's taking that physical performance that's happening at church, that performance that's covered by the religious service exemption, and then they're retransmitting it to another site or another place. But really, in this case, we're talking about a website. They are retransmitting it to a hosted environment, whether it's the church website or another place. Then there's on-demand expectations, I'll say, where church attendees, today there's an expectation that you could go back at a later time and watch the service in its entirety. Both of these are examples of rights or activities that are covered under the WorshipCast streaming license. And one great thing about this license is that it covers the exact same songs, 28 million songs, that we referenced in the Perform music license just a moment ago. So that's a huge selling point, and there's a very wide variety of songs that are available there. When you purchase a WorshipCast license, you are licensing your church website. So the license isn't for the church as much as for the URL for the website itself. And it covers a wide array of church-sanctioned events that you might want to stream, not just your service per se. As we discussed earlier, streaming is not defined or referenced in the religious service exemption. There was a push at the beginning of COVID to see if Congress would relook at this, and it didn't gain any traction. I think folks were hoping that streaming could be included as an exempt activity, but we've been fielding lots of questions on streaming over the last 12 months due to COVID, and we've seen an exponential increase in churches that are purchasing licenses and getting the appropriate rights to stream their services online. Another option that you have if you are live streaming, you want the ability to save and archive your services for on-demand usage for your attendees or congregants. This option here with CCLI allows you to also post to third-party platforms such as YouTube, Facebook, and Vimeo. And we'll talk about some of the challenges with that in a moment. But it also allows for traditional podcasting. CCLI's streaming license started actually in that podcasting environment where that was the primary means that churches were using at that point in time for sharing their services. They had moved on from cassettes and CDs and were starting to do podcasting a bit more. Initially, it allowed for just the pastor to share his notes because it was his it's his message, theoretically his copyright, and then CCLI was able to get the rights for podcasting the worship services from their publishers. So they launched the church podcasting license. Streaming started to take off over time. They added streaming to the name, and today it's just called the church streaming license. I apologize for the long digression there, but still, it's worth just sharing that this sort of solution has been in play for a while. Podcasting is still alive and well, as I'm sure you guys know. Many churches are coming to us saying, how do we get our services on YouTube? We want to be able to post them to YouTube or Facebook, and we don't want them taken down, or we don't want ads placed on them. That's the real challenge with posting to third-party platforms. CCLI's agreements with publishers allow churches to post to third-party platforms, but CCLI's terms can't override the terms of these platforms. YouTube has its own terms. Facebook has its own terms. And Vimeo, which is a great option, they have their own terms of agreement that you must agree to when you post videos there. Specifically on YouTube and Facebook, there's the possibility that you'll receive a takedown notice. In many cases, YouTube will identify either the underlying composition or the sound recording that you're using, and you'll get an email that will say something along the lines of, we've identified copyrighted material in your video. Don't worry, we've set it up so that the right owner will receive compensation if there are ads that are monetized on that video. Nothing for you to be concerned about. Where we run into issues in that scenario is churches will dispute that claim because they believe that they own that video. The fact is, at least a portion of that video where a copyrighted song is being either performed or a copyrighted sound recording is being played, that portion, they can't claim it, especially under a CCLI license. It's very clear in the terms that ownership of that video belongs to the rights owner whose content is being used. So you're at the mercy of this third-party platform, whether it be YouTube or Facebook, as to whether you receive a takedown notice or ads are placed on the video, or in Facebook land, there's a possibility that your audio will just get muted. It's a bit more of a safe solution if you can get your church services streamed on your church's website, where you're in control. You don't have to worry about ads or takedown notices or muting of your audio. Vimeo is a great option as a third-party platform if you're looking for something like that, because they don't do the content identification that Facebook and YouTube does, at least at this time. So if you're doing these sort of activities that we have listed, if you're posting to third-party platforms, or you'd like to make your services available on podcasts, the church streaming license with CCLI is a great option for you. There's some churches that are currently posting to these third-party platforms, and you've got it figured out, you know kind of where the lanes are, but you don't have the appropriate licensing. Well, then by all means, the church streaming license is the option that you would need if you're posting to those platforms. Worshipcast, the website that it allows, is your church website. Finally, we're going to talk about streaming of sound recordings. I hit on it for just a moment there. Sound recordings, that would be an audio recording. It could be a Hillsong worship song that you have you've sourced off of iTunes or Amazon, Spotify, you name it. Master recordings are just what I was explaining there. That's what they are. It's a master recording. This would be applicable if you're using it during a countdown timer at the beginning of your service. Sometimes master recordings are used during transitions from worship to speaking, maybe during announcements, also during closing of services. Once again, we're specifically talking about the streaming aspect. But if you're using master recordings in the physical service, remember the religious service exemption covers that. But once we're outside of the service and we're streaming, in this case, well, then you're going to need a license to cover streaming of master recordings. Other examples that are common today, using multi-tracks or stems. You can source these at Loop Community, multi-tracks, praise charts, worship backing band, and many other locations. Worship bands use these to fill out the sound and add sometimes some of the, it could be electronic sort of sounds that you would hear on the artist's version of a song. Multi-tracks and stems are considered sound recordings that you would include in the stream. And then we have accompaniment tracks, which have been around a bit longer, that could be sourced from Daywind, Lifeway, Maranatha. All of these are examples of activities that could be licensed under CCLI's Streaming Plus license. Streaming Plus covers both the composition, like we were talking about previously, everything that you could do under the streaming license, as well as sound recordings, audio recordings, master recordings. They're all the same thing. So I've explained 3 different options, or 3 different levels, so to speak. Here's some factors that you'd want to consider if you are doing any of these activities that I've described. Where are you streaming or streaming from? Are you going to be using your church website exclusively? Are you using a third-party platform, or the goal is to get on a third-party platform and do it that way? There are many churches that do it successfully. That's a key determinant. As I shared with you, Worshipcast, you license your church website. The church streaming license from CCLI, you can use third-party platforms, but we explained there's some challenges that you just have to navigate if you're taking that route. What types of events are you streaming? CCLI's church streaming license focuses on services at the church. The WorshipCast license covers really any church-sanctioned event that you would stream through your church website. So if there's a broader set of events, maybe there are weddings that you would want to be able to stream, and just anything else that might come up, special events where there's performances. That's not a gray area on the WorshipCast license. It's most definitely covered. Under the church streaming license with CCLI, the focus is services. As a third element, what music or catalogs of music will you be streaming? As I shared, WorshipCast covers all of the same very extensive library of songs available under the Perform Music license, so both secular and sacred music. This would include like patriotic music that might not be registered with CCLI. There's Christmas music. There might be country music in some cases that churches are using. Those would be covered under the WorshipCast license. CCLI's church streaming license is more focused on worship music. I think it was 26 or 28 million songs on the WorshipCast side. On CCLI's, we're looking at closer to 500,000. Still, the popular songs that you're singing in most churches today, but if you're going outside of that repertoire, then you might want to consider WorshipCast. And then a big one, if you're including master recordings, as I described on the previous slide, if you're including those in your stream, unfortunately, that's not an option on WorshipCast. So you would need a CCLI Streaming Plus license that would cover both the compositions or the performance of the song and the playing of the master recordings. So I hope that helps. I know that's a lot of information to digest, but those are the 4 key things to consider, at least to start with, as you're trying to decide which direction you're going to go with your streaming license. So for next steps, if you want more information on the WorshipCast or Perform Music license, you can go to CCS's website, christiancopyrightsolutions.com. There'll be information on those licenses. You can also connect with one of the customer service representatives. If you're interested in finding out more about the copyright license, church copyright license, remember that's Reproductions, go to ccli.com. And then the variety of streaming license, Streaming Plus license, both of those we mentioned. I didn't cover the rehearse license, which allows worship bands to share master recordings for rehearsal purposes. And then we have a product called Song Select, which is a sheet music distribution service. Real quickly, I'm going to cover, try to review some of the questions that you submitted before this webcast. Some of it will be review, some of it will be just a quick point on something that I didn't address. One of the questions was, fair use allows us to change lyrics of a song without permission. That would be considered an arrangement or an adaptation. Congress really created fair use to allow churches and institutions to exercise the rights of copyright owners for the purposes of criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, and research, not for changing something that is copyrighted so that it aligns with, the lyrics that you would like to sing for a service. So unfortunately, I think that's a stretch. Publishers are quite, they're focused on ensuring, and song owners, by the way, when I say publishers, it could include either a group of song owners or an individual one, but they like to make sure that their songs remain in the form that they created it. And changing lyrics is not something that goes unnoticed. They're quite particular about that. The religious service exemption allows us to stream our music from our services without getting licenses. I think we covered that one pretty clearly. You need a license in order to stream. Churches are allowed to play or perform secular songs within their services. That's correct. Secular songs aren't differentiated from sacred songs. with a religious services exemption. If I use 10 seconds of a song, do I need permission? If you're performing it, you're playing it in a service, that's covered by the religious service exemption, so you don't need permission. One thing to throw in, if we're talking about streaming and you're using a public domain song, that song is no longer covered by copyright. The copyright protection has expired, so public domain works. You don't need licensing for that. If that was a question that any of you thought of or it was on your mind, just know that we're talking strictly about copyrighted songs for getting licensing. Because we are a church or a nonprofit religious organization, the US copyright laws don't apply to us. I think we hit that with the religious service exemption. There are those couple cases with performing the song or playing a audio recording or displaying the work, but that's just a couple of the many uses that we're doing in churches. Those two are exempt. Everything else you need licensing for. One blanket license is all we need for everything we do. I went through I went through 5 different blanket licenses, and there's many more. Blanket licenses cover specific types of activity. That allows you as a church just to identify the things that you're doing. Maybe you're not using master recordings in your stream. Well, you shouldn't have to pay for that then. So we would rather you purchase only the worship cast or the church streaming license so that you're not paying additional fees to be able to do these other activities. In that case, a audio recording. Streaming that, of course. Does our church need performance licenses from ASCAP, BMI, and CSAC? Thankfully, no. You can purchase the Perform Music license directly from CCS. And since they work with those 3 organizations, you just work with CCS and you have all of those rights in that Perform Music license or worship cast. If we don't sell our CDs or DVDs, do we need to get a license for songs? Unfortunately, that is still a reproduction. And actually, it's not only a reproduction, it's distribution if you're giving it away. So you do need to secure the appropriate rights in order to give CDs or DVDs away. We covered that that is an option if it's your services under the CCL or the church copyright license. Finally, what is the process and the cost to get a copyright license for everything we do? This is one that depends on your church size. And then you say everything that we do, as we shared, there's a lot of different activities. They're broken into different licenses so that you're only paying for the rights in a blanket license, the rights that you're using. So just contact either CCS or CCLI, and they'll be able to help you identify based on your activities the appropriate licensing. But it's going to be a bit easier than going to individual publishers and securing rights for each song. I did not expect to go 54 minutes. Maybe it wasn't 54 minutes. However long it went longer than I expected, but I hope that this time was helpful for all of you. And I just pray that you guys are blessed and that this has answered some of the questions that you might have about copyright or religious service exemption, some of the licenses that are available. If you have any questions or concerns, please do reach out to CCLI or CCS. Just by doing a web search, you'll be able to find the contact us information for either, and we'd love to help you just to secure the rights that you need so that you can continue to hold services and just serve your congregations.